Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book. In this season 09, episode 21, diving into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History, 5th edition, we explore how foreign occupation in Korea and Southeast Asia paved the way for the rise of communist parties, leading to decades of conflict and profound transformation. Today, we're taking on a deep dive into a really pivotal period of 20th century history, looking at how foreign rule kind of inadvertently fostered the very movements that would reshape these nations. We'll unpack the unique paths each country took, from devastating wars to some surprising economic shifts and, how they grappled with their communist identities.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating in here, I think, is how a single catalyst, this foreign occupation, unleashed such diverse and often, tragic outcomes across these very distinct regions. We'll try to connect the dots from that initial resistance right through to the long-term geopolitical and humanitarian implications, showing why understanding this history is still crucial for today.
Okay, let's start by unpacking the complex story of Korea. The sources tell us it spent, most of the first half of the 20th century under Japanese rule. But after Japan's defeat in World War II, the dream of an independent, united Korea, it just fractured very quickly.
Exactly. You had the Allies, the USA, UK, and China. They promised a united Korea back at the Cairo Conference in 1943. But the Soviet Union's 11th hour entry into the war against Japan just dramatically reshaped the whole post-war landscape. Soviet troops poured into the north, bolstering Korean communists and nationalists, which, directly paved the way for Kim Il-sung's emergence.
Right. And on the flip side, you have the Americans, deeply concerned about a complete Soviet takeover of the peninsula, hastily sending their own troops to the south. And what's remarkable here, the source points out, is that it was the Americans who actually proposed the 38th parallel as a dividing line. Just temporary, they thought.
And in the South, Dr. Syngman Rhee quickly rose as this fierce nationalist and crucially anti-communist leader.
So this decision, it just fundamentally altered that original Allied promise, didn't it?
It really did. I mean, both the U.S. and USSR initially said they wanted a unified Korea, aligned with their side, of course, but neither was really prepared for deep, long-term involvement. So the problem got punted to the UN.
And the UN proposed nationwide elections.
Yes, but Kim Il-sung refused elections in the North. He knew communists would likely be a minority across the whole country because the South had a larger population.
Okay, so elections only went ahead in the South.
That's right, making Rhee president. Then the North held its own vote, declaring Kim victorious.
And both leaders then claimed legitimacy over the entire nation. You can see where this is going.
Absolutely. The withdrawal of all foreign troops by June 1949 left, a real tinderbox, and just a year later, June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces invaded the South. The Korean War began.
Devastating conflict. The source mentions at least 4 million Korean lives lost by 1953.
Yeah, staggering numbers. And it cemented the division into two heavily armed, deeply suspicious states that we, still see today.
So, after the ceasefire, what did this mean for North Korea specifically? How did Kim Il-sung consolidate power?
Well, Kim, with crucial Chinese assistance, survived the war and then ruthlessly consolidated his power. He eliminated rivals within the Communist Party. He would rule as an absolute leader for 4 decades, developing his own unique spin on Marxism-Leninism, the Rouge principle.
You show that's the self-sufficiency idea, right?
Exactly. His initial program aggressively pushed for industrialization and collectivization, all aimed at economic self-reliance. Though the irony, of course, is that he initially relied heavily on significant aid from the USSR and China to get things going.
Did living standards improve at all?
For the first decade, yes, there was some improvement. Alongside this relentless emphasis on military strength, though, and this period also saw North Korea become one of the most isolated states on Earth, with the government exercising just total control over information.
But that didn't last, did it? The economic situation deteriorated.
It did. By the mid-1960s, economic cracks really began to show. The widening Sino-Soviet rift was a big factor. It significantly impacted the aid flow.
Right, they were caught between Moscow and Beijing.
Precisely. And excessive spending on heavy industry and armaments, plus a rapidly growing population, severely strained agriculture. Living standards started to fall noticeably.
And then Kim Jong-il takes over in '94. What was the situation then?
By the time Kim Jong-il, the dear leader, took over, North Korea was in deep crisis. The economy was collapsing, the population had tripled since the 50s, and they were on the brink of widespread famine, despite pouring immense resources into nuclear weapons development.
Plus the collapse of the USSR, Their key patron was gone.
A huge blow. So Kim Jong-il, who was initially seen as potentially more open-minded, was forced into some drastic moves.
Like trying to improve relations.
Yeah, he sought better ties with the South and the USA. He even agreed to shut down plutonium plants in exchange for light water reactors from KEDO, that international group.
Right, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization.
And for a time, U.S. economic sanctions eased, missile tests were suspended, and there was even that historic visit from U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright.
But internally, things were still bad.
Terribly bad. Reports in 2001 painted a grim picture. Severe food shortages, alarming child mortality rates, a drastic drop in access to safe water, vaccinations. North Korea became heavily reliant on substantial international food aid just to cope.
Were there any attempts at reform inside the country?
Some very limited economic reforms were introduced in 2002, devaluing the currency, allowing food prices to rise. There was a slight glimmer of improvement by late 2003.
But it didn't stick.
No, it was short-lived. By 2005, soldiers were back monitoring rice collection, private selling was banned again, and then those chilling reports emerged of vast labor camps for political prisoners, very reminiscent of Stalin's gulags.
And the nuclear issue just escalated again.
Dramatically. Especially when George W. Bush came to power in 2001 and famously labeled North Korea part of an axis of evil. The whole dispute revolved around suspected nuclear weapons development, and North Korea's behavior was, well, consistently inconsistent.
How so?
Refusing international inspectors one minute, restarting plants the next, withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, claiming they had nuclear weapons, all while demanding a non-aggression pact from the U.S. It was very hard to read.
So the big question, as the source notes, was bluffing for aid, or did they really have them?
Exactly. And by February 2005, they flat out announced they had nuclear weapons. Then in October 2006, they claimed a successful underground test.
Which must have strained relations with South Korea even further.
Immensely. More nuclear tests followed, naval clashes. The sinking of the Cheonan corvette in 2010 was a major incident, and the bombardment of Yeonpyeong Island, too. These often coincided with joint South Korean-U.S. military exercises, which the North always saw as preparations for invasion.
And when Kim Jong-il died in 2011, his son, Kim Jong-un, took over.
Yes, and broadly speaking, he continued those same established policies. The pattern, sadly, continued.
Okay, let's shift focus now to Southeast Asia, starting with Vietnam. Part of French Indochina, under French colonial rule.
That's right, along with Laos and Cambodia. The French built some infrastructure, sure, but most people were impoverished peasants, and any protest was brutally suppressed.
And that suppression, ironically, fueled nationalism.
Absolutely. It drove immense support to Ho Chi Minh's Vietnamese Communist Party, formed back in 1929. Ho Chi Minh himself was a committed nationalist first, whose travels then led him to embrace communism. His dream was a united communist Vietnam.
The French defeat in Europe in 1940 must have raised hopes, but then the Japanese moved in.
It did. And then, after the war, you get this really critical turning point the source highlights. The British, after disarming Japanese troops, actually used those troops to suppress the Viet Minh in the South.
To restore French control.
Yes, and crucially to try and prevent a wider trend of decolonization across Asia. As one historian observed, if the South had just been allowed to follow the North towards independence then, the trauma of Asia's longest war might have been avoided entirely.
Wow. So the French came back.
They did. Initially, they sort of recognized North Vietnam's independence within a loose French union, but their real intention was to maintain control.
And Ho Chi Minh pushed for full independence.
He demanded it, which led to open hostilities, the French shelling Haiphong, and after 8 grueling years, the French were decisively beaten at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Which led to the Geneva Agreements.
Right. Recognized North Vietnam's independence, temporarily divided the country at the 17th parallel, and promised unification elections for 1956.
But here's where the Cold War really bites again. Those elections never happened, did they?
Never happened. The Cold War was in full swing. The Americans threw their weight behind the anti-communist Nguyen Ngo Dinh Diem in the South. He proclaimed the Republic of Vietnam in 1955, and that basically crushed the Viet Minh's hopes of winning national elections and uniting Vietnam peacefully.
So both North and South were devastated by a decade of fighting already.
Utterly devastated. The North, heavily backed by the USSR and China, pursued socialist policies. But Diem's government in the South became increasingly corrupt and unpopular, driving more and more people towards the Viet Cong, who were, of course, backed by the North.
And this leads eventually to the Vietnam War, the one involving the U.S. from 61 to 75.
Exactly. And when the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was finally proclaimed in 1976, after that war, the challenges were immense.
A ravaged country, millions homeless, and Ho Chi Minh himself had died back in 69.
Right. Their inspirational leader was gone. Recovery was a massive struggle.
How did the new government try to rebuild?
Well, they extended their centralized command economy policies to the south. But this met fierce opposition, especially in Saigon, renamed Ho Chi Minh City.
Why the opposition?
Measures were sabotaged. Many local officials, the cadres, were unwilling or just incompetent, and corruption was apparently rife. Collectivization efforts turned into a disaster, and even within the party leadership, there were serious disagreements about how long to stick to these pure Marxist-Leninist policies.
Plus natural disasters.
Yes. On top of everything else, major floods and droughts hit in the late 1970s. Combined with the collectivization mess and rapid population growth, it caused severe food shortages.
Leading to the boat people crisis.
Hundreds of thousands fled the country, yeah. A truly desperate situation.
And Vietnamese foreign policy caused more conflict, too.
It did. After aligning with Laos and Cambodia, Vietnam controversially invaded Cambodia in December 1978 to oust the brutal Pol Pot regime. They installed a pro-Vietnamese government, but this act infuriated China, who was Pol Pot's main backer.
Which led to China invading northern Vietnam in 79.
A punitive invasion, yes. And this created a really bizarre, unsettling geopolitical alignment.
Also,
China, the USA, Japan, most of Western Europe, they all imposed a trade embargo on Vietnam. Effectively, shockingly, this meant they were siding with Pol Pot's remnants against Vietnam.
supporting one of history's worst dictators. That's hard to fathom.
It is. The fear of a strong, unified Vietnam was that powerful. By the mid-1980s, Vietnam was almost completely isolated.
So facing this crisis, they changed course.
Decisively, in 1986, younger leaders pushed through drastic policy shifts, including a full withdrawal from Cambodia. Nguyen Van Linh introduced Doi Moi, a program for renewing the economy.
Moving towards a free market.
Exactly, moving towards a free market system, explicitly aiming to raise living standards for ordinary people.
And withdrawing from Cambodia freed up resources.
Huge amounts of revenue, yes, which could then be invested domestically. Economic progress was slow at first, but it picked up speed by the early 2000s.
They opened a stock exchange, reconciled with the U.S.
Yeah, first stock exchange in 2000, a trade agreement with the U.S., even a visit from President Clinton. It was a major turnaround.
And a reformer took charge in 2001.
Nong Duc Minh. He set ambitious goals. Vietnam as an industrialized power by 2020, high growth targets, equality for the private sector. They introduced anti-corruption measures, tourism boomed, and remarkably, by 2003, Vietnam was actually becoming an international aid donor, not just a recipient.
But politically, still a one-party state.
Absolutely. Despite the successful economic reforms, the Communist Party maintained firm control over everything. All election candidates still had to be vetted and approved by the party.
And there were still human rights concerns.
Disturbingly, yes. Reports from 2002-2003 mentioned abuses, particularly persecution of religious groups, like the Montagnard's accounts of beatings, torture, church burnings. The Vietnamese government consistently rejected these international protests, just dismissing reports as totally false.
Yeah, okay, let's move to Cambodia now. Another French protectorate, occupied by Japan during WWII.
Correct. Prince Norodom Sihanouk proclaimed independence in 1945, but like elsewhere, the French soon returned.
But Sihanouk took a different approach.
He did. He was a remarkably shrewd politician. He avoided direct confrontation, believing French rule wouldn't last anyway. He led the nationalist movement effectively and managed to keep Cambodia relatively peaceful while Vietnam was engulfed in war next door. The 1954 Geneva Conference recognized Cambodia's independence and Sihanouk's government.
He was popular, apparently, but also increasingly authoritarian.
Very popular initially, but yes, resentment grew over his authoritarian style, particularly among the communists later known as the Khmer Rouge.
And he abdicated to enter politics directly. That's unusual.
A clever move. He abdicated in 1955, won a landslide election, and stayed in power for 15 years. It was generally a time of peace and prosperity, despite the underlying tensions. He balanced authoritarianism with a sort of benign approach.
But his foreign policy caused problems with the U.S.
Big problems. He deeply distrusted American motives, was suspicious of U.S. allies like Thailand and South Vietnam. He tried to stay neutral, but even allowed Vietnamese communists to use bases and the Ho Chi Minh Trail inside Cambodia.
And when the U.S. started bombing Cambodian villages near the border,
He broke off relations with the USA completely and moved Cambodia much closer to China.
this is where things take a really tragic turn, isn't it?
Yeah.
Late 1960s.
Yeah, a terrible spiral. Sihanouk's popularity waned. He faced opposition from both the right and the left-wing communists, led by Pol Pot. The communists grew stronger, sparked an uprising, which Sihanouk then brutally suppressed, burning villages, murdering suspects. It got ugly.
And then Nixon and Kissinger started bombing inside Cambodia.
Massive bombings of Vietnamese bases inside Cambodia. But as the communists moved deeper to escape, the bombers just followed them. Cambodian civilian casualties soared.
And then the coup in 1970.
March 1970. Lon Nol, backed by the Americans, staged a coup while Sihanouk was out of the country in Moscow.
Lon Nol's rule sounds like a disaster.
An unmitigated disaster, according to the source. He rashly promised to drive out the Viet Cong, pulling Cambodia headfirst into the Vietnam War. Heavy U.S. bombing pounded the countryside, destroying hundreds of villages, but it utterly failed to stop the Viet Cong or the Khmer Rouge.
And the bombing continued even after the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam.
Yes, even after the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, the U.S. kept up massive aerial bombardments of Cambodia, a final, desperate, and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to prevent the Khmer Rouge from taking power.
So Cambodia's infrastructure, its economy, just destroyed.
Almost completely annihilated. In April 1975, Lon Nol's regime collapsed. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh.
They called it Democratic Kampuchea.
Anything but democratic. Sihanouk returned, expecting a hero's welcome, but was immediately placed under house arrest.
And Pol Pot implemented his extreme ideology almost overnight.
Immediately. Forced evacuations of all cities and towns, sending millions to the countryside to supposedly double rice harvests. Thousands died on these forced marches. Money, private property, shops, markets abolished, schools, hospitals, monasteries, all shut down.
It's just horrifying. And then the genocide.
A horrifying campaign targeting educated Cambodians, anyone seen as potential opposition, the infamous killing fields, up to 2 million lives lost.
Some estimates say a third of the population.
It's almost incomprehensible, and the source notes an interesting point some historians make, that maybe these atrocities weren't just from Pol Pot's ideology, but perhaps tapped into a longer history of violent extremism within Cambodian culture itself, making it uniquely horrifying even compared to Vietnam or Laos.
Pol Pot's paranoia led to internal purges, too.
Yes, even purging moderate supporters, many of whom fled. Ultimately, his own downfall came from his foreign policy picking fights with Vietnam. After border incidents, the Vietnamese army invaded in January 1979, drove out Pol Pot, and installed a pro-Vietnamese government led by Hun Sen.
But the UN didn't recognize this new government.
No, and neither did most countries. It's a stark point in the source. The USA and non-communist Southeast Asian states feared a powerful Vietnam more than they feared the Khmer Rouge.
So they effectively preferred Pol Pot's remnants to continue resisting.
That seems to have been the cold calculation, yes, for their own geopolitical interests. Chilling.
But the government installed by Vietnam, led by Hun Sen, did bring some stability.
Relatively speaking, yes. Over the next decade, they abandoned the extreme Khmer Rouge policies, towns reopened, basic freedoms were gradually restored, though still propped up by Vietnamese troops.
But opposition groups formed a government in exile.
They did Khmer Rouge remnants, Sihanouk's supporters, non-communists. The UN recognized them, even though they had little support inside Cambodia.
Things changed when Vietnam withdrew its troops.
That was the key shift. Vietnam couldn't afford the military presence anymore. This led to UN-organized talks, culminating in a 1991 agreement for a transitional government, including all factions, and UN-supervised elections in 1993. Though the Khmer Rouge refused to take part.
The elections went ahead anyway.
They did, resulted in a coalition. Sihanouk's son, Ranariddh, as first PM, Hun Sen as second. Sihanouk himself was restored as king.
But that coalition didn't last smoothly.
Not at all. A bizarre and violent feud erupted, ending with Hun Sen staging his own coup in 1997.
And Pol Pot died soon after.
He was arrested by remnants of his own forces and died in 1998. The question of prosecuting other Khmer Rouge leaders for crimes against humanity became hugely controversial.
An international tribunal versus the Cambodian system.
Exactly. The UN and Sihanouk wanted an international one. Hun Sen preferred the Cambodian system. Result: basically a stalemate on justice for years.
So by the early 2000s, things were calmer but still fragile.
Relatively calm, yes. Stable economy, growing tourism, but still heavily dependent on foreign aid. And then more problems. Drought and flooding led to serious food shortages in 2002-2003.
And the 2003 elections were problematic.
Marred by assassinations, yeah. Led to a constitutional crisis. Hun Sen's party won the most seats, but not a majority. Foreign observers reported widespread intimidation. Hun Sen refused to resign and just kept running the country.
So despite some growth, still major challenges.
Absolutely. Continued reliance on foreign aid, ranked among the poorest nations for nutrition. Violence, high crime rates deterred Western investment. Huge needs in healthcare, education, infrastructure remain unmet.
Okay, finally, let's quickly touch on Laos, the third country of former French Indochina, also a French protectorate.
That's right. After Japanese occupation, the French gave some limited self-government, but real power stayed in Paris.
And like elsewhere, nationalists emerged.
Yes, while some leaders were okay with the French arrangement, nationalists formed the Pathet Lao in 1950. They worked closely with the Viet Minh next door to fight for full independence. They became strong in the north, bordering North Vietnam.
The 1954 Geneva Accords allowed them regroupment zones.
It did, but given their left-wing ties, a lasting peace with the right-wing royalist government seemed, well, unlikely.
And civil war broke out.
In 1959, yes, it continued on and off and inevitably got tangled up in the larger Vietnam conflict next door.
So Laos became another proxy battleground.
Pretty much divided three ways. The communist Pathet Lao, backed by North Vietnam and China, the right-wing royalists, backed by Thailand and the USA, and a neutralist group led by Prince Suvarnabhumi, who tried to form coalitions.
There was a brief coalition in 1962.
A fragile one, yeah. Raised hopes of neutrality. But the USA was really unhappy that the Pathet Lao controlled key border areas, the ones that became part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
So the U.S. intervened.
Poured aid into the Royal Army. And in 1964, a CIA-backed coup overthrew the neutralist government, specifically excluding the Pathet Lao. The chance for neutrality was gone.
And then came the bombing.
Massive U.S. bombing as the Vietnam War escalated. From 1965 to 1973, over 2 million tons of bombs dropped on Laos.
More than on Germany and Japan combined in WWII.
That's what the source states. Staggering. An American community worker quoted described just widespread devastation, leveled villages, countless people buried alive or incinerated. The scale is hard to comprehend.
Peace only came when the U.S. left Vietnam in '73.
Only then. A new coalition was formed, but the Pathet Lao steadily gained control. In 1975, following the communist victories in Vietnam and Cambodia, the Pathet Lao took full power, ended the monarchy, and declared the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
And they implemented communist policies.
The Lao People's Revolutionary Party, the LPRP, introduced farming collectives, government control over trade and industry. They also imprisoned thousands in re-education camps. Recovery was slow, and about 10% of the population actually fled to Thailand.
But, like Vietnam and China, they eventually compromised on strict Marxism. Fortunately, yes. In the mid-1980s, they showed similar pragmatism. Collectivization was largely abandoned for family-run farms, state control relaxed, private investment encouraged. By 1989, UN statistics even suggested Laos's economy was performing better than both Vietnam and Cambodia at that point.
Politically still a one-party state, though.
Oh, yes. The LPRP maintained full control. But a new constitution in 1991 did allow more freedom of movement, which raises that interesting question the source touches on. With socialist economics largely abandoned, were they still truly communist?
What does the source suggest?
Well, the leaders described themselves as such, but economically, they had few specifically socialist features left. Maybe better described simply as one-party states rather than ideologically communist ones by then.
But the economy still struggled. Disappointing performance by the end of the century, yeah. Still heavily reliant on foreign aid. President Khamtai Siphandun acknowledged the lack of prosperity in 2001, outlined ambitious plans. But challenges remained. The 2002 election saw a reported 100% turnout, but nearly all candidates were LPRP members.
Signs of dissatisfaction.
Growing dissatisfaction, yes. Scattered demonstrations, even some bomb explosions by opposition groups pushing for reform and prosperity. In 2006, Chumali Saison became the new leader, facing these ongoing issues.
So bringing it all together, Looking back at Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, it seems undeniable that foreign occupation was a major catalyst, wasn't it?
A powerful, if perhaps unintended, catalyst for the rise of these communist parties. It set these nations on trajectories of really profound transformation, but also decades of often brutal conflict.
And connecting it to the bigger picture.
You really see this complex interplay of fervent nationalism, intense Cold War geopolitics, and these intricate internal dynamics playing out differently in each place. Each country experienced its own unique, often tragic, struggle. Korea's enduring division, its nuclear path, Vietnam's incredibly hard-won unity after devastating wars, then its economic shifts, Cambodia's descent into that unique, specific horror, and Laos's turbulent, yet maybe surprisingly adaptable path.
It's just such a powerful reminder, isn't it? How historical events, especially imposing external rule, can ripple through generations, shaping politics, economies, the very lives of millions long, long after the initial events.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. How do these deep dives into the lasting impacts of foreign occupation and the subsequent rise of communism challenge, or perhaps confirm your own understanding of that intricate web of 20th century global power dynamics?
Join us next time for another deep dive where we'll continue to unravel the complexities of our shared history.